Okay, so this is the Bible study for March 17th. It is continuing our fulfilled series in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verses 1 through 44. And remember that you can download the PDF copies of this Bible study so that you can follow along with us as we study at www.abqnaz.org/alive. And chapter 11 begins. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to the disciples, let us go back to Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago, the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. After he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. Verse 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? It's the same thing that Mary and Martha had said. Verse 38. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days. Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Just Jesus said to him, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." So number one says what is wrong with Lazarus at the beginning of this text, according to 11:1. Now this is not intended to be a trick question, but it is intended to set the stage, because once we've read the text like we just have, it's easy to jump to the end. So it's easy to say, well, he was dead, but actually in 11:1 he was not yet dead. It says that he was sick. And that's significant because of what Mary and Martha and everyone else said, and what we tend to think, which is um, that if Jesus had come right away, or if he had been there, that Lazarus would not have died, because he was not yet dead at the beginning of this text. The second part says, "What did Mary and Martha do?" according to 11:1 through 3. And in verse 3, it says, "So the sisters sent word to Jesus, 'Lord, the one you love is sick.'" So they sent word to Jesus to let him know. They were calling for him. They were asking for him to come. They knew that he needed to be there, that this was the only hope, the only solution. And the third part of this is, what do you do when you have a problem? Well, the obvious and hopeful answer is that I also send for Jesus. I also call out to Jesus. But unfortunately, the more accurate truth is that we worry and we rush to the hospital and we do about everything else except for call out to Jesus. But Mary and Martha knew that Jesus was the only hope. Number two says, how did Jesus respond when he heard the news, according to verses 4 through 7? A, he went right away. That's what we would have expected. That's what we would have hoped for. That's what we want him to do when we're going through something. But that is not what he did. It says in B, he loved them so, which is a funny thing. It tells us that he loved them, and then it says, so he stayed there 2 more days and then said, let's go back to Judea. Now, there's a couple ways to interpret this. I think probably the most accurate way to understand why it says it this way is that his disciples didn't want him to go at all, but he chose to go anyway. And so there's a sort of sense of what was the expectation, and so what do these sort of transitional words mean based on the expectation? So when we read the story, our expectation is that he would go right away. That's actually what Mary and Martha had hoped for and expected. And that's what some of the Jews thought maybe should have happened, that loved Mary and Martha and loved Lazarus, and said, if you'd been here, he would not have died. So they all expected him to come right away. Although I would say that by the time he found out, it probably was too late anyway, although there's no way the disciples could have known this, except for that Jesus began to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. But 4 days he was in the tomb by the time Jesus got there. And he waited 2 days before he left. We don't know exactly how long the travel time was back to Judea. But I would say that the chances are, if he had left right away, he might not have made it there anyway. But nonetheless, I think all of us would hope that he would just go right now, and maximize the chances. But Jesus He knows the outcome, and he was able during those 2 days to tell his disciples that it was already finished, that Lazarus was already dead. And then by the time he got there, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. Um, so I think that Mary and Martha's expectation, our expectation when we read it, is that he goes right away. So for it to say he loved them, so he stayed there for 2 more days, seems like a conflict. But to say that his disciples didn't want him to go at all, didn't understand the seriousness of what was going on with Lazarus. And it seems that Jesus, one, understood the seriousness, knew that Lazarus was dying and ultimately was dead before he got there to raise him from the grave. So he understood the seriousness, but he also understood that he knew the end of it all. He knew the outcome, and the outcome could happen exactly as it was intended, even with him waiting for 2 days. But if the expectation is that he would not go like the disciples, then the fact that he loved them, so he stayed 2 more days and then he went, actually makes a little bit more sense. Um, But I think we could also interpret this to suggest that there's something about the miracle that Jesus was going to perform. There's something about um, what God was going to do through this that made him waiting the 2 days and making sure that he had been in the grave for some time before he got there. It made that an act of love. And so that seems counterintuitive. That seems completely illogical to us. But if we know that Jesus knew what the outcome was and what he was planning to do, um, then we can see that also as an act of love that that affected their faith. Um, and impacted a lot of people around him and around them. Number three, why did Jesus' disciples protest when he said he was going back to Judea? According to verse 8, he says, they said, "But Rabbi, a short time ago, the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back." So they were concerned for his safety. They knew that his life was in jeopardy, and they could not believe that he would go back. And we're going to highlight uh, a couple of things um, about that here in a moment. Number four says, how was Jesus's relationship with this family? See verses 2, 3, and 5. A, it must have been pretty bad because he stayed where he was for 2 more days. So that's what it seems like when we read that. But that's not the case. B, Mary poured perfume on him and wiped his feet with her hair. They must have really loved him. And then C, it says that Jesus loved Lazarus and his whole family. So there was love on both sides. He loved Lazarus and Mary and Martha. He also loved him to the point where Mary would do such an amazing act of humility and service and pour that on Jesus. Number five, what happened to Lazarus before Jesus got there, according to verses 11 through 13? A, he was tired and fell asleep. B, Lazarus died. So we know that it's B. We know that he did not just fall asleep, although Jesus used that metaphor to refer to it, and his disciples were confused, and he had to clarify that Lazarus was dead. And he says, our friend Lazarus has died. Number six, why did Jesus let Lazarus die when he could have come earlier? A, he didn't really care about his family. Well, we just learned that that's not true. That's not what it said about him. That's not what we know about him. B, he didn't need to panic as we often do because he knew how the story would end. And I think this is really important. So let me just say that although none of us are Jesus, that we should be living with the Spirit of God dwelling within us, that same Spirit that was in Jesus, and that we should have an eternal perspective about life, and we should have his peace also in our life. And if we had those things, then I believe we would respond differently to crisis and not panic the way we often do, and maybe respond a little bit more like Jesus. But Jesus knew how the story would end, and that's why he didn't need to panic. Um, number or letter C, by this God's Son would be glorified. Verse 4. So Jesus knew that this was all in the plan, and he knew what he was doing, and he was going to be glorified through this act, even in Lazarus' death and ultimate resurrection. D, so that his disciples would believe, according to verses 14 and 15. It says, so then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. So he tells them that it's for their sake, that he's glad that he wasn't there, because now they'll believe, because he's about to perform this sign which glorifies the Son, which causes them to believe. Number 7, what was going on when Jesus arrived, according to verse 17 through 19? A, Lazarus has just died. Now, that's not exactly true. I mean, it depends on how we define just. Um, he had not just died, he had been dead for 4 days. So B says Lazarus had been dead for 4 days already, and Jesus had arrived during the funeral. Now, Jesus really knows how to crash a funeral. There's nothing that ruins a funeral faster than the person that's dead not being dead anymore. So they were all there gathered. People had come from Jerusalem nearby, from the town, to mourn, and they had already buried him. She's worried when he goes to open the stone, roll away the stone, because she says there's already going to be an odor. He's been dead for a while. Um, and so it wasn't right after, he had just taken his last breath. Oh, we barely missed it. It was days after he had been dead, and mourners were coming and going, and that was the custom. And it was more than just a little, half hour, 1 hour funeral or whatever, a graveside service that takes 15 minutes. This was a time of mourning when people came and went from their house regularly, to pay their respects and to mourn. D, many people from Jerusalem, um, which was nearby, had come to see the family, and all this is true here. Number 8, what did Mary and Martha do when Jesus arrived, according to verses 20 through 32? A, Martha went out to meet Jesus. Yeah, she did. She ran out, but Mary stayed home. See, Martha told Jesus that she knew he could have healed Lazarus if he had just been there. And so this is one of those um, complaints, wrapped in the form of a praise. I know you could have done something if you were here, but she's kind of complaining that he wasn't here. She had to have known how long it takes to travel and known that he didn't just come right away. D tells us Mary eventually came out too, but she also told Jesus that she knew he could have healed Lazarus. There's a missing word there. Could have healed him, or could have healed Lazarus. And she also says that she doesn't come out till Martha tells her, the rabbi is looking for you, the teacher is looking for you. Number 9, how do you respond when Jesus does not seem to respond to your calls? A, I'm angry at him, so I ignore him when he does show up. B, I run out to ask him why. C, I remind him of my trust in him. Um, it's a funny thing. That's what they did. They reminded him, they said, we know that you could have healed him. But although that seems like a praise or a statement of faith, it's really kind of a complaint. And I think sometimes that's the way we pray as well. Sometimes we say what we know, um, just to sort of remind ourselves and convince ourselves when we're having trouble really trusting in him, because he didn't show up and come through in the way we wanted him to, in the way we expected him to. Um, so Number 10, what did Jesus do according to verses 33 through 44? Well, we know, and this is all we can kind of summarize. We know, first of all, he wept, and he was moved emotionally, by those who were mourning, and by those that he loved, that were upset with him probably, and were mourning and hurting. But ultimately, what he did was he went and he raised Lazarus from the dead. Um, I hate to sort of make what seems to be the highlight of the whole story seem like just an afterthought, but I think we kind of all knew that this was what the outcome was going to be. Jesus said it from the beginning, that he was that Lazarus, this would not end in death. And so really it seems more telling to us what the disciples and what Mary and Martha and all these Jews that had come to mourn, what they did when they thought that Jesus wasn't coming through. That actually seems more significant to me than the healing itself, the raising of Lazarus itself, because that's what we knew was going to happen. That's what Jesus said was going to happen. But what seems more significant is what they respond, how they responded in the meantime, when they didn't seem to know that that's how it was going to end. And I say that because I think that is something that we need to look at in our own lives, in how we respond, when ultimately we ought to know that God has a plan. We ought to know that God is going to come through. But there are times when it's very difficult to see what that plan is and to see that God is coming through. And so in the meantime, how do we act? Well, we act very much like some of these do, actually, probably many times not near as um, filled with faith as they seem to be. I think many times we react much more in anger than it seems to describe them acting. And so we need to just sort of look at that in our own life, because ultimately, the healing of the miracle of raising someone from the dead is a bigger miracle than the healing would have been if he got there in time. So number 11 says, do you think that God might have a bigger miracle in store for your situation? So if he's not showing up when you think he should, and responding the way you think he should, is it possible that he's got a bigger miracle in mind than the one you were hoping for? And so let me just say this: we as humans and as Christians are notoriously bad at asking for things that God can do and wants to do in our lives, and we actually tend to often ask for much smaller things than God is wanting to do. So number 11 says, do you think that God might have a bigger miracle for your situation? Let's consider that.